Great, thank you. You should let me know if the sound fades or there are other problems, but otherwise, I'm very sorry I can't be there with you all. I wish that I could be in Italy instead of in Iowa, but unfortunately, I'm having to join you by Zoom, and I appreciate you're all putting up with us. I will try and make it worth your while, and I hope to see at least some, maybe many of you in Kirchberg next summer. I will definitely be there to continue this conversation. So let me see. The aim of this talk is to say a little bit about the work I've been doing on editing the early Wittgenstein, and partly because this is a project I've now been working on for quite some time without having brought most of it to public fruition. And it's really, I think, important at this stage to let some of you who are closely involved in Wittgenstein editing hear a bit about what I've been doing, and also to get your thoughts, feedback, and questions. Much the same spirit as Alois, I think that this sort of editing work requires input from the Wittgenstein community, and that's at least one of my aims in giving this talk today. I mean, personally, my main interest in Wittgenstein's philosophy has always been in Wittgenstein as a dynamic thinker, someone who was constantly changing his mind and always on the way to somewhere else. And for that reason, I've mostly in my previous work focused on the middle and later Wittgenstein, as it's so clear there that he's constantly engaging in a dialogue with his own work and that of others, and constantly developing. And until quite recently, I didn't realize that it was possible to do this with the early work. So it was very exciting to me to discover in the mid-2010s that there is a record of the process of revision that leads into the Tractatus, and that too is worthy of study. Let's see, we're getting a little static here. Is that happening to you too, or should I just ignore it? Are we okay over there? Checking. Is the sound still good at your end?
I think we're okay, at least on our
Good, okay. Just part of the mysteries of trying to have a conversation at a distance. I will do my best to ignore the strange noise. The work that I'm currently doing really comes out of my getting excited about understanding the composition process of the Tractatus and the way in which Wittgenstein's rearrangement and revision led up to that book. And so it was actually in 2015 that I taught a graduate seminar on this material. We talked about how best to represent the structure of the Tractatus and the structure of the revision process that led up to it. And one of my students suggested that the best way to get at the tree structure numbering arrangement would be to produce some sort of tube map style chart of it. You see that behind me. That's also available on the online Wittgenstein Tractatus Map. And I know that some of you are already acquainted with this. For those who aren't, I recommend a piece that I published in Nordic Wittgenstein Review in 2016, setting out some of this work in an introductory and expository way. So the Tractatus Map project was intended to show both the structure, the numbering structure of the Tractatus, and also the numbering structure of the Proto-Tractatus. And one aim there was to show how the material was gradually assembled out of its component parts. It's possible to see that on the Proto-Tractatus Map because it actually can be customized to show the contents of any given set of pages from manuscript 104, the source of Proto-Tractatus. And in that way, you can come to see in a graphic way how the Proto-Tractatus was assembled. I'm not sure to what extent online users of that resource have really appreciated this. So I'm going to briefly show you an animation at this point of our graphic representation. At this point, I need to share the screen, and I think I have been set up to do that. So here we are. Let's see, can we share this? Yes. So this is a graphic representation of the Proto-Tractatus with the aim of showing how it was put together. And at the moment, what you are seeing is a colored line showing the first 6 propositions of the Proto-Tractatus that appear on page 3. And this is actually capable of gradually being added to. So if we click a bit, we can see that on the next page, some of the material on the single decimals is added. And if we keep moving in this way, we can gradually see how Wittgenstein used the numbering system to assemble his book by adding material largely to the initial high-numbered remarks, gradually introducing more and more material that was attached to those remarks in descending layers, so to speak. So the tree of the Proto-Tractatus is gradually assembled in this way. You can gradually see more and more remarks being added to the structure. And an exciting point occurs around pages 64 to 70. I think at page 64 or thereabouts, Wittgenstein starts to add to proposition 6. We see the addition of the 6.1s on mathematics. And finally, on page 70 or 71, we get proposition 7 and the rest of the top level remarks in 6.1 through 6.4. And so in this way, one can see that in a fairly graphic way, that the 6s are added late, and just how Wittgenstein assembled his initial draft and then gradually included more and more material. So part of the ambition here then was to try and provide a digital graphic tool that would provide everyone with access to the composition process that led to the book. Let me just see if I can put this away at this point. All of this came together rather rapidly in the early part of 2016, and that's why it was all written up for Nordic Wittgenstein Review later that year. Excited by this progress, I wanted to extend the representation of the composition and structure of the Tractatus to include not just the Proto-Tractatus material, but also the notebooks, manuscripts 101 to 103. For a while, I thought that the best way to do that would be to focus on doing further digital design and coming up with a plan to provide an equally striking graphic representation of the relationship between the final stages of composition of the book and the notebook material. It turned out actually to be very difficult to get grant funding for this. And I gradually realized that the sorts of things that grant funders wanted to see done with manuscripts didn't really correspond to the particular vision that I had. So in the tradition of digital design, I pivoted and decided that this was going to have to be a translation project first and a digital project secondly. It had been suggested to me quite early on that what I really needed to do in order to complete this project was to work on a translation that would unify the Proto-Tractatus, the Tractatus, and the notebooks. Because a large part of this aim is to make this material accessible not only to Wittgenstein scholars, but to a broader audience that for the most part either reads in English or prefers to read in English, even if they can read in German. And for those who are really serious about this material, there are wonderful resources already available in German. There is, of course, the ever-expanding range of opportunities for engaging with this material offered in Bergen. And in particular, for those who care about the details of Tractatus composition, Martin Pilch's wonderful Proto-Tractatus tools provides an extraordinary resource. So for those of us who are gung-ho about working on the original texts and happy to dive into any level of detail, we are already remarkably well catered for. Part of the conviction behind this project is that this should not just be the preserve of a narrow cadre of devoted German reading Wittgenstein scholars who are happy to look at many different texts and versions, but that it should also be made accessible to a much broader audience that is unaware of this material. And that audience, for the most part, reads Wittgenstein in English, or at least even if they can read it in German, they seem most of the time to be happier with it in English. And the big problem that one faces at this point is that there is no uniform translation of this material. If you're interested in how Wittgenstein developed his ideas from the notebooks through the Proto-Tractatus to the Tractatus, the translations are deeply unsuitable. The closest we have to any kind of possibility of making use of a consistent translation is the fact that Pears and McGuinness translated not only the Tractatus, but also their edition of the Proto-Tractatus. And we make use of that in our online resource, which offers access in Ogden and Ramsey version, in Pears and McGuinness version, and of course in the German. But it became clear that what was really needed was a fresh translation that would contain not only those materials, but also all of the material in the 3 manuscript notebooks that we heard about already in the first session. I have been collaborating with Joachim Schulte and Katia Saporiti on this unified translation for several years now. And we've reached a point where the Tractatus translation is pretty much in final shape. We still have to do some work on the apparatus, and before we can have a finally published version, I think there's still another year's worth of work to do. The way that the translation was produced was to start by translating the manuscript notebooks and then to make use of that material in later versions as it was revised. The thought was that just as Wittgenstein had worked forward from his early versions to the later versions, a conscientious translator trying to provide such a translation should do the same, and that this would aid in the project of having a consistent translation. That was extraordinarily helpful. However, the translation we now have of the manuscripts is in a much less polished state than the Tractatus. I mean, the Tractatus translation, I think, is essentially finished, or at least close enough to finish that there will just be a little bit of adjustment around the edges as we notice occasional problems. But in the process of making the Tractatus translation in its final shape, we've inevitably ended up having it go a little further from the previous version that we produced in the notebooks. So that will be a further editing challenge. The aim of all this, ultimately, however, is to make all of this available in the public domain. It's an important part of this vision that all of these materials be available to others to mix and remix as they see fit, and that this not be yet another walled garden owned by a publisher that will be difficult for others to access or make use of. Working out how to actually produce such a public domain edition of all this material has itself been extraordinarily challenging, particularly as we also wanted to at least publish the Tractatus edition with a major press and not run the risk that if it were only available online, it wouldn't receive the kind of widespread reception and respect that such an edition needs in order to get traction with the widest possible community. So as a result, the plan is to initially published the book with Cambridge University Press, but published it under an open access license. And when I say publish the material, I actually mean just the Tractatus at this point. There will be a Tractatus edition in English and German, both in the order in which Wittgenstein wanted it to be published, and also in a tree-structured arrangement for those who prefer to read it that way. And that will then be published open access 12 months after it's been published in print. And because it has been published in open access, at that point, we will be free to reuse that material in an edition of the Proto-Tractatus and notebooks online. So it is going to still be a couple of years before we have copyright clearance to do this. We have also negotiated permission from the copyright owners in Trinity, and we are close to coming to a satisfactory arrangement with Bergen for their contribution to this material. We can talk more about the publication and permissions component later on if you wish, but that at least is sort of part of the vision that's informed this. Let me see. So at this point, I want to move to telling you a little bit about the notebook end of the publication project. There is a natural structure available in the Tractatus and Proto-Tractatus, and that they're organized around a numbering system. And that's the key that we use to organize the presentation on the Tractatus Map. The question then arises, how does one go about integrating the source notebooks, given that they have a very different structure? They are, after all, manuscript sources that are not numbered in the same way. So in the end, the solution that we arrived at was to present the notebook material in date order, to see it as a sequence of dated entries. And I think that's particularly valuable because so far the print editions that are available have divided it down the middle into the material that Anscombe saw fit to publish as the notebooks 1914-16 and the material on the verso pages, variously described as diaries and mostly in Geheimschrift in Wittgenstein's code, as was explained to us so nicely earlier on today. So it seemed particularly valuable to bring the parts back together again. And on the other hand, there seems to be little point in bringing them together in precisely the way that they appear on the manuscript page. That's something that the Bergen edition does very nicely for those who wish to see the facsimiles and to see a print version of that material. But for the more casual reader, what one is interested in is to see Wittgenstein's writing in order and to see what he wrote on each day and to see it in sequence. So that essentially was what we tried to do. So without more fuss, I hope at this point I can share my screen with you and actually give you a chance to take a look at this. I should say that this is a very much a work in progress, and it's mostly just got far enough to be presentable to you, but it remains something that needs considerably more work, both in terms of the details of the translation and in terms of getting the material to display quite as we would like. But with those reservations, let me try and share my screen with you again. And all being well, we should be able to see the Wittgenstein's, let me see. I should probably not try and mess around with things, or I will mess it up. Anyway, so I hope you are currently seeing Wittgenstein's notebooks in Wittgenstein's handwriting at the top of the page. And then you should also see a timeline in the middle and Wittgenstein's very first entry on the 9th of August, 1914, in the left-hand column. We're using a left-hand column to correspond to the verso pages of Wittgenstein's writing for the most part. I freely acknowledge that this involves some editing decisions. We follow more or less the division that Anscombe created in choosing to create the notebooks 1914-16. And as a result, there's a certain amount of material that actually appears on the recto page, but Anscombe didn't use because it's diary material. And that appears in our timeline, as it does also appear in, let me see, as it also appears, of course, in the Geheime Tagebücher and the more recent private diarist translation. So at the moment, you're seeing it in German. All being well, I should be able to press a key and bring up the, let me see if I can do this. That's the German original, so this should be the English translation. So yes, here we are. This is Wittgenstein's diaries in our translation. And if you keep scrolling, you keep seeing Wittgenstein's diary record of his first few days as a soldier. We see Wittgenstein gradually realizing just how awful his comrades are turning out to be. Now, we do actually have the coded material in italics in the German, following established convention, but in the interest of making the English maximally readable, we drop that in the translation. We're still working on some of the finer details. It's a little unfortunate that the gaps between these pieces of text are so large, but it turns out that's actually quite challenging. So if we keep going, we finally, on the 22nd of August, get to the point where we have entries of both a philosophical kind and the diary record. So logic must take care of itself, frequently referred to as the first item in Wittgenstein's notebooks, is of course nothing of the kind. It's the first item in Anscombe's selection from his notebooks. And part of what one sees immediately is that Wittgenstein is getting an opportunity to work at this point because they're stuck on a sandbar. They haven't been able to go anywhere for the last 3 days. And he keeps actually working on his philosophy as a result. From the very beginning, there are parallels in Wittgenstein's life and Wittgenstein's philosophical writing. Later on, we see him developing an elaborate military metaphor for his philosophical writing. Let me see. So anyway, that's just to give you a slight glimpse of how things get started. However, the aim here is not just to provide a convenient reading edition of both our English translation and the German, but also, as I told you originally, to provide some access to the relations between this material and the Tractatus. So if we skip ahead now to May 1916, let me see. So we do have this convenient mouse over. So although we only show dates, you can actually mouse over each date and see all of that nice Bergen reference material here. This tells us that our entry on the 6th of May is also just near the beginning of MS 103. And those who know this material well will know that this is shortly before Wittgenstein is drawn into the Brusilov offensive and the most dangerous and trying times of his wartime service, which is saying quite something. And if we keep going a little further, he's being fired upon. As we see in the diary, he's expecting a Russian attack. Things are going to get a lot worse. And here we get to the well-known remarks from June 1916, where existential issues and religious issues enter into the notebook entries. And all being well, we can now, good, yes, if we press on another key, we can now actually get cross-references. So we have highlighting here on 2 of the lines on the 11th of June. The relevant Tractatus passage for the second is displayed, that life is the world, Wittgenstein says, in part of this lengthy series of reflections. And we see that the Tractatus tells us that the world and life are one. The gray highlighting here is intended to indicate that this is a comparison text, that it's clearly relevant and similar, but it's not what one could plausibly regard as a mere variant on the Tractarian material. The boundaries between the various categories are themselves a little difficult, but we can talk about that later if you want. I think there's actually fairly good rationale available for doing it this way, but it's certainly an issue worth discussing. You will also notice that we don't actually have the Tractatus 6.41 passage at the moment. That's one of the many wish list items. By and large, most passages only have one cross-reference, so let's move on to cases where we don't have that particular glitch to worry about. That's actually the only case in this little test sample. So on 5th of July, Wittgenstein writes, "The world is independent of my will." There's also the relevant Tractatus passage displayed on the left-hand side, showing that it is indeed the very same wording. And similarly, also on the 5th of July, there's another remark that is very close to the Tractatus, but there are just enough differences that it gets highlighted in yellow rather than green. This is actually, it's perhaps worth saying, a set of distinctions that essentially are already present in the Anscombe edition, because Anscombe marks what we consider green passages by simply providing a Tractatus cross-reference, what we regard as yellow or similar passages by using the word C, and the gray passages are CF. So, and here's another gray passage. Ultimately, of course, we want highlighting on the Tractarian passage as well. This cross-reference remark does tell you that this is the first paragraph that's being cross-referenced, but obviously in the best of all possible worlds, this would be highlighted too on the left. That again is something that will take further markup and will no doubt get done in due course. But I think there's at least enough here that you can see how this works. And obviously, this should also happen in the German too. At the moment, as this is purely a test bed sample of a few key remarks, we've just got the markup done in English. You can already see the German, and I suppose that's something that I should provide. So there we are, there's the German. So we do have the cross-references, we just haven't got them in highlighting yet. And let's see if we can get back to the English at this point. Yes, there it is. So, so anyway, that in the very briefest introductory outline is part of our vision for how this will work. As an online tool providing intuitive access to the development of Wittgenstein's notebook thoughts, and also as a way of redressing some of the problems that are created by the sundering of Wittgenstein's manuscript notebooks into 2 separate streams of publication and research. I think that this will certainly help, and all being well, all of this material will also be made available in texts that those who prefer to work with this material in more traditional ways can do. And those who would like to have online access to this will also be able to download it and do what they want with it. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but I think rather than continuing to fill you in on some of the details of this project, I would rather open this up to questions and see what sorts of issues or problems you have. Thanks very much.